Tokyo, March 1946. The city did not roar, it whispered. Rubble lined the streets like broken teeth. Paper lanterns hung crooked over gutted storefronts. Children played hopscotch between scorched tram tracks, their laughter thin as rice paper. Japan had surrendered 5 months earlier, but surrender was not peace. Peace was something yet to be invented. Into this quiet walked Kenji Sato, age 28, once a junior archivist at the National Diet Library, now employed by the Civil Censorship Detachment, a branch of the Allied Occupations General Headquarters. His job? To read. Not secrets. Not codes. But ordinary things, letters, diaries, school essays, newspaper drafts. Anything that might impede the objectives of the occupation. Kenji wore a threadbare suit, polished shoes with cardboard soles, and carried a small notebook bound in indigo cloth. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need one. His power lay in what he chose to erase, and what he chose to let pass. He had survived the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945. His younger sister, Aiko, had not. She'd been 17. Her last letter to him, never sent, was found in the ashes of their home, folded inside a copy of Basho's travel journal. It read, "Brother, if words can rebuild, then write until the world stands again." Kenji never wrote poetry. But he began to count silences. The censorship office occupied the 3rd floor of a former insurance building in Yurakucho. Windows were cracked, patched with rice paper. Desks were mismatched, some Japanese oak, others American steel. Every morning at 7:30, Kenji arrived before anyone else. He'd light a single kerosene lamp, brew weak barley tea, and open the day's mail sacks. Inside, hundreds of envelopes, mostly from civilians. A mother in Osaka asking if her son's name could be cleared from a war criminal list. A teacher in Kyoto submitting a revised history textbook. A teenager in Hiroshima describing cherry blossoms blooming near the ruins. Official policy required censors to flag anything that glorified militarism, criticized the emperor's new role, expressed anti-American sentiment, revealed defeatist attitudes. But Kenji noticed something else. People weren't writing about war. They were writing about absence. About rice quotas. About missing neighbors. About the sound of trains returning. Their grief was quiet, precise, and utterly human. One letter, from a widow in Nagasaki, simply listed the names of her students who never came back to class. No commentary. Just names. Kenji read it 3 times. Then he stamped it, approved, though technically, listing the dead could be seen as dwelling on loss. He began keeping copies. Not of everything. Only the ones that felt like seeds. Kenji lived in a 2-room apartment in Kanda, shared with his elderly uncle, a retired calligrapher whose hands now trembled too much to hold a brush. At night, by candlelight, Kenji would transcribe fragments from the letters he'd approved. Not full texts, just phrases that stayed with him. The river still flows, though the bridge is gone. My son asks if Americans eat rice with chopsticks. I planted daikon where the shrine used to be. He never wrote names. Only places. Dates. Emotions distilled into single lines. His uncle watched him one evening and said, "You're not copying words, Kenji. You're collecting breaths." Kenji didn't answer. But he understood. These were not documents. They were echoes of a nation learning to speak again, carefully, softly, after years of shouting. At work, his American supervisor, Captain Eleanor Reed, praised his efficiency. She never read the letters herself. She trusted Kenji's stamps, approved in green ink, withheld in red. What she didn't know was that Kenji had begun using a 3rd stamp, carved from a cherry wood block, inked in faint gray, marked only with a small circle. It meant, this truth must survive. He slipped those pages into hollowed-out books in the office library, dictionaries, agricultural manuals, railway timetables. A quiet archive within an archive. In May 1946, a new directive arrived. All personal correspondence mentioning atomic effects was to be confiscated and destroyed. No exceptions. Kenji's hands grew cold when he read it. He'd already processed dozens of letters from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, descriptions of hair falling out, skin peeling like old paint, children coughing black phlegm. One man wrote, "We call it the shadow sickness. The doctors have no name for it." That week, Kenji approved only 3 letters from the affected cities, all vague, poetic, avoiding medical terms. But late one night, he returned to the office. Using a borrowed key, he retrieved 5 withheld letters. He copied their essence onto rice paper, then burned the originals in a metal basin on the roof. The next morning, he filed a report, "No atomic-related mail received this week." It was his first lie. But it felt like loyalty, to the dead, to the voiceless, to his sister, who never got to describe her own last hours. He began visiting Ueno Park on Sundays. Not to mourn, but to listen. Students debated democracy under ginkgo trees. Farmers sold sweet potatoes wrapped in newspaper. An old man played shakuhachi flute near the pond. Kenji sat on a bench and wrote nothing. He just remembered how silence could hold more than noise. Summer deepened. Black markets thrived in Shinjuku alleyways. American soldiers bought silk kimonos for cigarettes. Japanese women traded heirloom lacquer boxes for cans of powdered milk. Kenji watched it all, not with judgment, but with the eye of a cataloger. One afternoon, a young woman approached his desk. She placed a single sheet of paper before him. No envelope. No name. Just a poem. "They took our swords. Our flags, our voices. But they cannot take the way my grandmother folds origami cranes. Each crease a prayer. For a world that forgets to bomb." Kenji looked up. She was gone. He stamped it, approved. But that night, he added it to his hidden collection, this time, not in a book, but tucked inside his sister's copy of Basho. Captain Reed noticed his growing quietness. "You're working too hard, Sato-san," she said one day, offering him a Hershey's bar. He accepted it politely, then gave it to a boy outside the station. He wasn't tired. He was full. Full of words he couldn't speak, truths he couldn't share, grief he couldn't name. His notebook now held over 200 entries. He called it Shizuka no Cho, the Ledger of Silence. In September, the first post-war elections were held. Posters appeared overnight, women voting for the first time, farmers demanding land reform, intellectuals calling for a new constitution. Hope flickered like a match in wind. Kenji's workload shifted. Now he reviewed political pamphlets, union flyers, student manifestos. Most were passionate, clumsy, full of borrowed American phrases. But one stood out, a handwritten leaflet from a group of Hiroshima survivors. "We do not ask for pity. We ask for memory. If you forget what happened here, it will happen again, somewhere else, to someone else." Technically, this violated the ban on spreading fear. Kenji knew he should withhold it. Instead, he made 3 copies. One he hid. One he mailed anonymously to a Kyoto newspaper. The third he left on Captain Reed's desk, with a sticky note, "Public morale source. Recommend study." She never mentioned it. But the leaflet appeared, word for word, in a small progressive journal 2 weeks later. Kenji smiled for the first time in months. Winter came early in 1947. Coal was scarce. Kenji and his uncle burned old magazines for warmth. At work, morale dipped. The initial idealism of occupation had hardened into bureaucracy. Censors were told to watch for communist infiltration, a phrase so vague it could mean anything. Kenji grew cautious. He stopped taking papers home. Instead, he memorized key lines, reciting them silently on the train ride home. He developed a system. Left hand in pocket equals remember this phrase. Right hand on railing equals forget this name. One day, he intercepted a letter from a schoolteacher in Nagasaki. It contained a list of children who died from radiation sickness, names, ages, symptoms. Attached was a sketch, a classroom with 32 desks, 12 empty. Kenji's hands shook. He knew this was the kind of document that would vanish forever if stamped withheld. So he did something radical. He typed the sanitized version, removing names, softening symptoms, and submitted it as a public health inquiry. It passed censorship. The original, he memorized. Every name. Every age. That night, he whispered them aloud in his room, like a sutra. Tanaka Yumi, 8. Kobayashi Ren, 9. Sato Haru. His sister's name came last. Sato Aiko, 17. By spring 1947, Kenji's ledger held over 400 entries. He no longer needed to hide them. He carried the words inside him, like stones in a river, smoothing with time but never dissolving. Captain Reed was transferred to Osaka. Her replacement, Major Paulson, was less trusting. He demanded weekly logs of withheld materials. Kenji complied, but only with trivialities, a complaint about bread rations, a poem criticizing rain. The real silences remained unrecorded. One afternoon, Paulson confronted him. "You approve too much, Sato. Are you sure you're not sympathetic?" Kenji bowed slightly. "I follow the guidelines, sir. But the Japanese people are learning to speak again. If we silence every trembling voice, what will be left to rebuild?" Paulson stared at him, then grunted. "Just don't make me regret keeping you." That night, Kenji visited the ruins of the Imperial Library. He knelt in the ash and placed a single origami crane, folded from a page of his ledger, on the stone steps. It wasn't protest. It was promise. In June 1947, the new Japanese constitution came into effect. Article 9 renounced war. Article 21 guaranteed freedom of speech. Kenji read it 3 times in one sitting. For the first time, he wondered if his work had become obsolete. But censorship didn't end, it shifted. Now, the focus was on national security and social stability. Letters mentioning labor strikes, student protests, or U.S. military bases were flagged. Kenji adapted. He began approving letters that implied dissent through metaphor. The cherry tree blooms even when the gardener prunes its branches. My neighbor's radio plays only one station. But I hear birdsong through my window. He knew Paulson wouldn't understand the subtext. But the Japanese readers would. And that was enough. His ledger now included not just grief, but resilience. Not just loss, but quiet defiance. He titled a new section, Kotoba no Tain, Seeds of Words. In October 1947, Kenji received a letter with no return address. Inside, a single sentence. "You are not alone. Others are listening too." No signature. No clue. But tucked in the fold was a pressed chrysanthemum, Japan's imperial flower, now fragile, dried, but still whole. For weeks, he searched for the sender. A librarian? A fellow censor? A teacher from Hiroshima? He never found out. But the message changed him. He stopped seeing himself as a lone archivist of silence. He was part of a quiet network, people who preserved truth not by shouting, but by remembering. He began leaving small replies, in approved letters, hidden in plain sight. The river remembers every raindrop. Even paper can carry memory. He never knew if they were understood. But he kept writing. When the occupation formally ended in 1952, Kenji was offered a position at the newly re-established National Diet Library. He accepted, but only on one condition: he would help rebuild the archive of civilian correspondence from 1945 to 1952. Most records had been destroyed. But Kenji had his ledger. And over the years, he'd quietly encouraged others, a postal clerk in Kobe, a school principal in Fukuoka, a bookseller in Kyoto, to keep their own notes. Together, they compiled fragments, letters, poems, diary excerpts, market lists, children's drawings. Not official history. Human history. At the library's opening ceremony, a young journalist asked him, "Why save these ordinary things?" Kenji replied, "Because empires write history. But people write memory. And memory is how we stay human." Kenji never married. He cared for his uncle until the old man's death in 1958. He lived in the same Kanda apartment until 1983, when arthritis forced him to move to a smaller flat near Ueno Park. Every morning, he walked to the pond and fed the koi. Every evening, he read from his ledger, not to mourn, but to remember how silence once held a nation together. In 1986, a university student interviewed him for an oral history project. She asked if he ever regretted working for the censors. He stirred his tea slowly and said, "I didn't serve the occupation. I served the words they tried to erase." There's a difference. Kenji Sato's story is not about espionage. It's about custodianship. In a world rebuilding from ash, he chose not to speak, but to listen. Not to lead, but to preserve. He had no title. No uniform beyond his threadbare suit. No weapon but attention. Yet he safeguarded something fragile and essential, the right of ordinary people to grieve, hope, and question, even when the world demanded silence. Today, his ledger, Shizuka no Cho, is housed in the National Diet Library's special collections. It contains no secrets. Only truths too quiet for headlines, too human for archives. And on the first page, in his careful hand, is a quote from Basho. "Every day is a journey, and the journey itself is home." In an age of algorithms that amplify outrage and erase nuance, Kenji's lesson feels urgent. Truth doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes, it comes in a child's letter about cherry blossoms. In a widow's list of names. In the way an old man folds a crane. The most radical act isn't always to speak. Sometimes, it's to remember what others try to forget. Kenji didn't change history. But he made sure history wouldn't forget the people who lived it.